Dirty News. We've seen 3 full days of testing in Bahrain, and the biggest hot takes from media and social media is that everyone seems to think that Aston Martin are back. Are you buying into that propaganda? Mercedes, according to most, are still trailing and in danger of being sucked back into the claws of the midfield in the guise of Aston Martin. Red Bull, it seems, according to everyone, are basically untouchable racing gods. And they are doing a fairly good impression of that description. McLaren, according to some, seem to have got a bad car on purpose to specifically hurt Lando Norris. And overall, reliability is very good. Very, very few flags compared to previous testing sessions. And despite the nerfing of the floor rules, the cars seem to be a good 1 to 1.5 seconds faster than last year. So we are going to go through some detailed looks of what the teams have done. Well, certainly the teams that have interested us. But first, let's look at the factors that disguise pace and why we might not see everything just by lap times. Right, so I'm a bit of a hypocrite because I say lap times mean nothing, Matt, but I am sitting there looking at lap times. Lap times give us a kind of a baseline to just start our guesses at.
Yeah, with the caveat that the team has to be doing like an actual simulation and they're not testing out a bunch of different other stuff that you're not even remotely aware of. They can give you an idea, but I mean, really, it's fun for the teams that are playing. And there are definitely some that play the let's go fast on the softest tires game, especially if you tune in the last 90 minutes or so on the last day of testing.
And the first day.
But I was kind of not joking. I have rarely seen a testing session I can recall, and maybe this is just because I've gotten deeper and deeper into the sport, where so many teams showed up with absolutely ulterior motives that had nothing to do with lap time. And we can get into which teams and what they were up to a bit later.
Well, I think in general, though, if you're looking for the lap times, there's a few reasons that are obvious where teams can actively go about and disguise their lap time. So they can put more fuel in it, and they can, for example, run a different wing, or they can have drivers lift off between sector timings or lift off before the end of the lap, or just not push. And there's, I guess, you can turn down the engine modes as well, Chris. So there are some things that the teams can actively do to say, right, we don't want to show you our full pace, because you don't want to panic teams into going, oh my goodness, we need to change our whole concept because Williams are top of the grid by 8 seconds.
No, exactly. There's a lot of things that they'll be doing. They will have a checklist of things that they're trying to check, and ultimately is about finding the good balance, making sure that the car isn't absolutely wayward and terrible. It's about finding a nice baseline setup, making sure the car is reliable, and like the things you mentioned there, they've got to do things that apply to other tracks, not just the one they're running on, which is,
yes,
there are characteristics such as it's very abrasive, it's quite bumpy, it's incredibly hot, there's a lot of straights on it and big braking zones, so there's other factors that they have to apply to as well. Of course, they're running tires as well that they're not going to run at that Grand Prix next weekend as well, so there's a multitude of reasons why it's not just a case of whoever was fastest in testing is going to be the fastest when we go racing.
But there is a range, isn't there? So, for example, Mercedes could run between, I don't know, X and Y, and that's their range that they could sandbag from or perform and glory run to. So obviously, Alpine's bracket for doing that is lower. So there's going to be obviously a big overlap in that. But there's only a certain amount of that. You can still see, are they able to run broadly near the top?
Yeah, and Alpine is one of these teams where everybody's thinking there's a lot more to come from them. They seem to be sort of quietly confident that they've been able to get everything out of testing that they've needed to without necessarily having to throw on a set of C5 tires and go for a really, really good lap time. And a lot of people are saying that, that they're going to be right in the mix at the front of the midfield, despite what we've seen in testing.
And teams do have different characteristics, and we'll get to that in a moment. But Alpine is certainly one of the teams that do tend to kind of hide a little bit in in testing. Although I will say, Matt, yeah, they're doing a particularly good job, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, we will. But I just wanted to give an example. Like I was talking with a former engineer, and they were like, well, even if you're looking at long runs, for example, he's like, you have to know, was the driver told to go out and bang the tires, or were they told to gentle it in? And someone held up an example of like, oh, well, here's a long run, but you can see at the very end, suddenly they go faster, which means that the team said, drive to this lap time because we think that's the most possible. And then the driver said, well, I think there's some left in the tires. So even when you're looking at these times, very, very large grains of sodium chloride need to be applied because there's a lot of context that goes into generating these numbers that we may not be aware of and may not be able to deduce from the information we do have.
And if you say you notice, in turn 14, we're just lacking a little bit of a front end, and we could get more lap time if we turn the rear downforce up with the spinny pokey thing, right? But then you go, wow, but if we do that, we're not testing the wing in the way we want to test it for the rest of the season. So you're not going to like dial in to turn 14, even though you could gain 0.4 of a second, you're going to just continue with your test. So there's some kind of non-deliberate sandbagging things where there's just no point in pursuing the out and out lap time during testing.
And of course, some teams as well are going to be bringing updates to the first race of the season as well. So, this may not even be the final version of the car that starts the season as well. And of course, a lot of the teams as well, this was kind of their first appearance of the car, like the Red Bull, for example. Like, yes, they had their car launch in New York, but that was not the RB19. And it was the same for a few teams as well. Like the Haas, we got the first look at the Haas as well. So they have to go through some quite basic and fundamental things to kind of kick that off and make sure the car's actually working. One thing that we sort of did glean from this is that the cars seem to be about a second to a second and a half faster than this time last year, which is what you'd expect. Obviously, at the start of last year, it was the beginning of a brand new set of regulations, and the development was going to be incredibly rapid. But that big gain has still been made despite having their wings clipped a little bit with these floor regulation changes that were supposed to help stop porpoising.
Absolutely. It's going to be evolution rather than revolution at this point. But also don't forget, there's still a lot of them still hunting for sponsors. So some of the teams might be tempted to, as you say, kind of run low or run light to try and attract sponsors or new drivers or whatever. And don't forget, in testing, you don't have to run a legal car. You can do whatever you want with it. So gone are the days when they would just strap on a much bigger engine or whatever, but you don't have to run anything as if it's in part firming conditions. So
your team Williams Catman in 2014, didn't they? They ran out basically a stripped out shell of a car that rocket launched in testing, looked like it was leading the field by a long way, and then rocked up at race one with a handy martini sponsorship.
Exactly. That was a very profitable test for them and was in no way, shape or form anything like the car that they went racing with.
No. And then on the other hand, McLaren turned up with so many sponsors that they needed a revolving e-ink board to fit them all in. And that actually, I've heard that the e-ink and the changing of the e-ink heavily weighed them down. But they did calculate that they could fill up to 80% of the driver's view screen with adverts without inducing seizure.
I like that. I mean, we need these sorts of innovations if Formula One is to continue making obscene amounts of money, which of course means we get to continue watching cars go around tracks.
Yeah, it is amazing. For those who haven't actually seen it, so on the side of the cockpit, it's basically an Amazon Kindle screen that just changes the sponsor every minute or so. It's absolutely impressive technology and great innovation there from Zach Brown and his team. But as you say, it adds a little bit of weight. I think it was 190 grams per panel.
That's okay.
Which is, a couple of locks of Lando's hair. So,
but when you consider that the paint on a Formula One car can add up to 6 kilos, then this seems to be the direction to go in as well. And actually, just following up on what you said about not having to run a legal car, you also don't have to do a legal lap time either.
That's true, yeah.
Because you can exceed track limits as much as you want. No one's really going to do anything about it. So it could well be that the best times we saw there were multiple track limits violations. Really, the only one that I've seen in detail anyway was the fastest lap from testing that was set by Perez, because it was on the YouTube.
So in Abu Dhabi testing, the young driver testing, why don't the young drivers, to make themselves look really good, just skip the chicanes like Alonso did?
Because I think it will show up in the data when the team actually go and analyze the data.
Yeah,
Rats,
I think
there's my shot at a seat gone then, never mind.
But we are kind of just building this picture to go, okay, look, the teams weren't specifically going for a lap time. For example, Mercedes looked to have run a higher downforce rear wing for the whole test, and said they wouldn't be running that in the race. A lot of the teams spent a lot of time on the Matt, you're going to have to help me out here, on the C5 and C4 tire, which are like basically in old money, the soft and super soft. Or the soft and ultra soft. Remember the ultra soft, the purple one.
Yeah. Remember the hyper soft as well.
There wasn't a hyper soft. The hyper soft was plaid, though. That's the difference. So they were running tyres, Matt, that they aren't going to run in the races, as Chris mentioned earlier. The C3, the yellow sidewall tyre, is going to be the soft tyre for the race in Bahrain. So it makes no sense really to run a tyre which didn't look like it was lasting the whole lap, but they need to know how that tyre runs.
Exactly. I feel kind of proud that you have mastered the Pirelli tire basics.
Thank you, Trumpets. You have taught us well.
This is what 8 hours of testing a day will get you.
No, yes. This is what 8 years with Matt Trumpets will get you. Eventually, you have to accidentally learn how the Pirelli tires work.
Yeah, it's impossible to avoid because I talk about it so much, it just seeps into your brain.
And I actively try to not listen as well.
Despite your best efforts. No, I like the fact that you brought up the Mercedes running the high downforce wing, which isn't really appropriate to the track. Ferrari ran a medium low downforce wing, also not appropriate. They did bring a new wing with instead of the twin stalks that had a Wylon configuration, but they had issues with DRS. So neither Ferrari nor Mercedes, for example, were running an appropriate aerodynamic package for the actual race all 3 days. You might have noticed if you watched any day one coverage, there was a lot of bouncing. A lot of the teams were exploring the lowest possible ride heights that that might set off the new sensor for bouncing that the FIA is running on the cars. So you'll get long chunks of time where the teams are purposefully running setups and configurations that aren't right for the track. And this is one reason why it's worth, bearing in mind that the lap times may not be entirely representative. There are other things we can bring to bear on that. And I should probably mention Alpine too, which I don't even think they might have done partially a single race sim, but mostly they were very focused on testing setups that come along with their brand new rear suspension because they have entirely rebuilt the rear end of that car.
Absolutely. And that's another reason why you can't even look at what the cars are doing on track and go, oh, well, that car's oversteery, understeery, because they're not running an appropriate setup or even suspension geometry for the circuit. So when people go, oh, well, the Alpine looked bouncy on its rear end, that's just not what they would run here. So it's so hard to tell what they're actually doing, but I'm sure we can make conclusions anyway.
Yeah, well, what I love about that is they actually, Mike Harmon, again, referenced that and said that, we have some new technology in the rear end that's going to let us run low and very, very stiff. But it required us running those configurations on this track, which is very bumpy and not really where you want to be running those kinds of spring rates. But it was more important to learn than it was to make lap time.
So now that we've painted the picture for you of why you definitely shouldn't read too much into the lap times, let's read into the lap times and give you our best analysis of F1 testing 2023. So, while it's fun to dig into the details while watching the testing, the best thing to do is just to absorb it, learn, try and read some body language. I will tell you actively also not to look at the lap times. Ignore the live timing. But I'm a massive hypocrite because I am sat here with my HB pencil and my notepad writing down lap times and sector times as they appear on the F1 live timing app. And I've always done this kind of thing to a certain extent, just to give me a baseline to work from. But the biggest thing to do is to put those lap times into context. So yes, I sat there and I spotted on the morning of day 3 that George Russell and Sergio Perez went out at a sort of reasonably similar time, both on the C3 tyre, which will be the red walled soft tyre in the first Grand Prix in Bahrain. And it looked like they were both doing race simulations of the early phase of the Grand Prix. So heavy fuel, soft tyre, let's see how far we can make this tyre go into the race to give us the best strategic option. So not necessarily out and out pushing. And for all the caveats we've described above, we can't tell how representative the times are. Both the drivers I was watching in that stint didn't have a huge amount of tyre deg, looked very comfortable on the wheel. They weren't snapping, they weren't struggling. So if you listen back to our masterclass with Bradley Philpott, we could get the idea that they weren't on the edge. They weren't on the limit of what they could do with the car, which, to be fair, they wouldn't be doing in stint 1 of a race anyway. So I'm sitting there marking it down. I'm like, ooh, okay, well, for their chosen performance in this test, actually Red Bull are a little quicker in sector 1, a little quicker in sector 3, and a lot alarmingly quicker in sector 2. What can I read into that? Nothing. But it's an interesting thing to look at. The most useful thing I look at when I'm trying to say, well, which teams are going to do well out of testing or based on what I've seen in testing, the most useful thing is in the middle of a regulation set, how were those teams doing at the end of last season? Where did it look like they were going? And historically, how do they approach testing? So I don't think this is controversial that Mercedes tend to hide quite a lot in testing. They go about their plan. Not only do they not worry about the lap times, they actively tend to hide lap times, and they go into the season knowing they're going to develop in season. It's very much part of their season plan to develop in season and finish strongly. Red Bull are a little bit less like that. They may well develop in season. They're incredibly good at it. It was their big strength over Ferrari in the previous era of Formula One, but they don't seem to play as many games, perhaps, as Mercedes. Ferrari look like the opposite. They actively want to show strength. That seems to be the Ferrari mentality. If they have some pace, if they're feeling good, they want you to know about it. So relative to the top teams around them, they tend to fall away between testing and the first Grand Prix. And I also just like to take the position that in modern Formula One, mid-regulation, there isn't often a wild swing between the relative positions of the car. So at the start of the hybrid era, yes, Mercedes briefly had Williams as their company as a distant second. But then once Ferrari and Red Bull established themselves as second and third, that order stayed pretty consistent for years as Red Bull slowly clawed their way back. When Red Bull established themselves as the lead car chasing down Brawn, they could have won trophies in 2009, you could argue. They then became that dominant force through the blown diffuser era. Ferrari settled into second, had their odd shot at glory, and McLaren flattered to deceive in that kind of third place. But generally, I agree with Trumpets. Do you want me to say it again? I agree.
Please.
I agree with Trumpets. One of the best things you've said about testing is you can't tell the pace. You can tell very little about pace, but you sure can tell when they're having problems.
Yes, absolutely. And if we're going to talk having problems, I'm afraid that everybody's favorite, McLaren, seemed to be top of the list across the 3 days of testing. And unusually, we know the reason for that. And it's that they've made a mistake and found they'd gone down a development path, but they found it too late to fix it for the start of the season.
So that's a good example of a problem you can see. I'm just going to stop you going down the McLaren path, because as it happens, McLaren are going to be the first team that we cover kind of in depth. But Chris, on the general guessing the order of things, what do you look for?
I think, the ease of which you can go about your testing. And if there's one team it's been incredibly easy for, it's Red Bull. And I think if there's one prediction that you can make after testing, it's that Red Bull are going to be up at the front of the field, because it was just effortless.
Which is, to be fair, what you would expect before testing. So you would have predicted Red Bull to come in, and we did predict this in the last show. We did say, unless Red Bull have done an incredible fluff, they're going to turn up business as usual.
To an extent, yes. But even when, at times the Mercedes looks like a handful, or the Ferrari doesn't look so good out on track, at no point is anyone looking at the Red Bull thinking, oh, that doesn't look quite right. It just was fast, and it was clean, and just, effortless for both Verstappen and Perez to glean laps out of it.
And that performance was never guaranteed for Red Bull, because we were just saying that the cars are probably a second to a second half faster than they were last year.
Yeah.
So if they turned up with last year's car and were a second and a half behind, they would be mid-table at that point. So, to stand still in this business, you have to make progress. So, they still had to evolve that car, even though it looks quite similar on the outside. They've made subtle changes and obviously quite good changes that have meant that it's allowed them to maintain that position.
Okay, so we're going to get into the specifics of the teams, but I'm going to give you my order, and just tell me if you wildly disagree with me, because when I went on Twitter with my order, nearly every reply was telling me that I was mad. I don't think anyone agrees with me, but I'm sticking by my guns that I think Red Bull is still on top. I think Mercedes are second and catching up. I think Ferrari will continue their trend of falling away. Alpine will solidify fourth place, mainly based on Matt's reassurances. And Alpine will rise to fifth, somewhat through performance, but also because it looks like McLaren are having an absolute nightmare and will fall away. Is there any wild discrepancies from that?
So I think the general consensus at the moment is that Mercedes doesn't quite have second nailed down. I think everyone's expecting...
Wait. Over the course of the whole season, not turning up day one in Brazil.
Over the course of the whole season depends on a million different things.
But we're judging here. We've got to be careful here. We're judging who is going to be first, second, and third at the end of the season, not who's going to have a bit of a spike at the beginning of the season.
Okay, but all we can look at from testing is what's going to happen in the first 4 races at best. So looking at the start of the season, all you can really look at and say is Red Bull are very quick. Ferrari, if there is going to be a challenger to Red Bull in the early stage of the season, it will be Ferrari. Mercedes have a little bit of work to do. And potentially it's going to be Aston Martin that leads the midfield pack and even knocks on the door of the top 3.
Yeah, I didn't realize that plan for Alonso was to just depose Vettel and take his rising steam. But yeah, I would agree that I think Aston have made good progress. I don't think they will have launched past Alpine by any stretch. And the struggles that Alpine have been supposedly having in testing, the team don't seem worried. So I'm not worried, because for me, the biggest thing that you can tell is not the behavior of the car on track, because we said that's adjusted by so many different things. It's not even what the drivers or the teams say, because we know that they lie through their teeth, but it's how they say it. And people like Alpine have been quietly confident, as they always are. But yeah, McLaren have been saying things and through gritted teeth, and it does not fill me with confidence. They will definitely fall away.
Keeping it general, Matt, anything shocking from my order, or at least like you can see my working out. I think I've presented my working out okay, even if Twitter's yelling at me.
No, I appreciate you showing your work. It makes it easier for us to point out where you've gone entirely wrong.
Fantastic.
I did notice that that Alfa Romeo were rather low in this pecking order. They're even below the Red Bull B team, or maybe not for much longer Red Bull B team.
I didn't even split. Honestly, Haas and Alfa Romeo kind of go hand in hand. So yeah, I just had those two lumped in just above Williams.
Not even with Guan Yu Zhou's amazing
He
lap
won
time
day
that
two,
he pasted.
didn't he? He won day two. There was fireworks. There was celebrations. He was doing donuts as well.
Yeah.
You think a team that lost its technical director over the winter is going to beat 3 of the teams on the grid?
We all know it's not the who's got the technical director now. That'll nail them for next year or development later in the year. Just like the new Ferrari boss, he's going to have no influence at all on what Ferrari actually do this year.
Trumpets, you were rudely interrupted.
It's okay. I'm used to it being both a father and a teacher. Happens all the time.
And co-host of Missed Apex.
And yeah, that too. I would disagree with Ferrari. I think Ferrari right now pose the biggest threat to Red Bull. And if we talk about Ferrari, the team, I'll explain why I don't think testing was entirely representative for them. Mercedes, I think, will be closer. And again, there are reasons for that. If you're a Mercedes fan, do not give up hope based on this test. This was incredibly important for them to validate the direction they're going in, not for absolute lap time. That's coming in the future. But the biggest mystery to me is Alpine, which showed us nothing that made any sense at all, but told us many things that sound fantastic. And Aston, which showed us, I'm thinking, possibly everything they possibly could. But it's that thing where all the teams develop, all the teams gain time. And so is Aston really going to be fighting at the front for podiums? It would be a remarkable development for them to gain what would it be, like a second and a half between the end of last season and the beginning of this season. It's more believable that they might be fighting at the front of the midfield for fourth place.